Welcome to this League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, American Society of Civil Engineers Wisconsin section program on Wisconsin's roads and bridges infrastructure. This is the second of 7 meetings on the American Society of Civil Engineers 2020 infrastructure report card. There are 13 categories in all that they evaluated, and we will have 5 more meetings on the rest of the 13 categories. Each meeting will have an overview presentation by category authors, and we have invited panelists with complementary perspectives. Then, following the presentations, we have a discussion with authors, panelists, and the audience. And at the end of the program, I'm hoping that we have information about the program, the tapes or the recordings of these programs. They will be available on the League of Women Voters YouTube channel for those particularly elected officials, we hope, who were unable to attend but want to see the program. Next slide. The first question that we have gotten on this collaborative effort is, why is the League of Women Voters working with the American Society of Civil Engineers? And we'll answer that. Then we have a little information about the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin and also the American Society of Civil Engineers Wisconsin section, and the report card itself, just a little background on each. Then there are presentations by the authors of the Rhodes category, Brian Udovich and his team, and a presentation by Tony Castle and his Bridges team. After the presentations, we'll be introduced to the panel, and they will have a few minutes for comments, and we'll open it up to the audience for questions with the authors and the panel. And basically that is the program tonight. We'll finish up with next meetings and other information. So why is the League of Women Voters working with the American Society of Civil Engineers? Well, we were invited. Carl Sutter sent an email and asked if I thought the League would be interested. So after we read the report card, we decided, yes, that we would work with ASCE on educating the public. And this meeting is part of that effort. The report card evaluates 13 categories of infrastructure: aviation, bridges, dams, drinking water, energy, hazardous waste, inland waterways, ports, roads, solid waste, stormwater, transit, and wastewater. This is infrastructure we all rely on every day. When we looked at the grades, we were intrigued because the highest grade was received by the energy category. They received a B, which means adequate for now. All of the rest of the categories received C's, which means mediocre, requires attention, or D's, poor, at risk. The report card basically is giving us a heads up that we can't take these systems for granted. They are aging. These infrastructure categories are large projects. They cross local and state jurisdictions and require public financing to maintain, build, operate. All are designed to serve the public and protect the environment. Because we, the people, ultimately pay for Wisconsin's infrastructure, we will be asked to pay to fix it and address issues such as the pandemic that we're currently in the middle of and climate change. for two examples. The League felt that it is our civic responsibility to become better informed and our civic duty to contact our elected officials with informed input. We support increased investment in infrastructure so we can fund improvements, ongoing operations and maintenance, and innovation. As we learned during the overview meetings, we can raise infrastructure grades and pass valuable assets on to everyone's children. What is the, Daniel, you want to back up one more. Thank you. The infrastructure report card is done or investigated every 4 years. And ASCE Wisconsin section published their 2020 infrastructure report card last, I believe it was September. These are produced by volunteer civil and environmental engineering teams who collect data, they coordinate with state agencies to make sure it's accurate and analyze the data. Then they prepare, review, revise, and develop the final report. Next slide, please. Every category is evaluated based on capacity, condition, funding, future need, operations and maintenance, public safety, resilience, and innovation. And you will hear the authors of Roads and Bridges tonight reference those criteria. Next slide, please. Now, Carl Sutter will give us a little background on the American Society of Civil Engineers.
Well, thank you, Carol. The American Society of Civil Engineers is the oldest professional engineering organization in the United States. It is a not-for-profit society and was founded in 1852 in New York City. It is worldwide with over 150,000 members in 177 countries. It also consists of 9 institutes which specialize in specific areas of civil engineering. These institutes are architectural engineering, coasts, oceans, ports, and rivers, construction, engineering mechanics, environmental and water resources, geotechnical, structural, transportation and development, and utility engineering and surveying. The Wisconsin section of ASCE was established in 1923. It comprises most of the state with the exception of the area near Superior and consists of 4 branches and 1,886 members. ASCE works to raise awareness of the need to maintain and modernize the nation's infrastructure using sustainable and resilient practices, advocates for increasing and optimizing investment in infrastructure, and improve engineering knowledge and competency. Civil engineers are global leaders building a better quality of life. Our society mission is to provide essential value to our members and partners, advance civil engineering, and serve the public good. Our code of ethics lists that engineers, first and foremost, protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. This presentation is part of our advocacy and education effort. Next, I'd like to welcome Louise Petering, the president of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, who will give us a brief introduction to the League of Women Voters.
Thank you, Carl. The League of Women Voters of Wisconsin has 2,800 members in the local leagues you see on this Wisconsin map. Our work is recognized by over 500 members and supporters across our state who contribute to our mission to empower voters through education and advocacy and to defend democracy. Next slide, please. The League is a nonpartisan, inclusive advocacy organization of over 100 years that it neither supports nor opposes political parties or candidates. We are nonpartisan, though we are multi-issue. Our membership is increasingly diverse and reflects our commitment to defending democracy for all, as demonstrated by our diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. We are political. We advocate on many issues based on established positions after member agreement and discussion. I should say discussion and agreement. Being a multi-issue organization, our members understand that infrastructure undergirds all of our communities and affects our environment. Our league has a natural interest in infrastructure. Back to you, Carol.
I'd like to remind everyone the next section of our program are the presentations by the two category authors. And while you are listening both to the presentations by ASCE authors and then subsequently the talks by members of the panel, if you've got questions, please enter them in the chat and let us know who you want to direct the question to. After we finish the panelists, Morgan Grunau will, she's the league's communications manager, will monitor the chat and will address your questions. But first, we're going to hear from the authors and the panelists. Next slide, please, Daniel. This is the road icon. This is the grade D+. Brian Udovich is the Rhodes lead author. And Brian is going to introduce his team, and following his introduction, we'll have his presentation.
Thank you, Carol. As Carol indicated, my name is Brian Udovich. I graduated with a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from UW-Platteville and have a master's degree in civil engineering from Marquette University. I'm a registered professional engineer in the state of Wisconsin and have over 25 years of experience in the transportation and construction industry. I began my career as a project engineer, project manager, consulting, specializing in transportation and traffic engineering, including rural and urban roadway design and traffic studies. I'm currently the Highway Operations Manager for the Jefferson County Highway Department, where I oversee the design, construction, maintenance, and operations of the county trunk highway system roadways and bridges. In addition, I've been a guest lecturer at Marquette University. I'm a member of the Institute of Transportation Engineers and the American Public Works Association, but I'm most active in the American Society of Civil Engineers. I've served as president of the Wisconsin section and am currently chair of the Construction Institute, in addition to being involved with the development of this infrastructure report card. The second member of our team is Andy Burt. Andy is a graduate of UW-Platteville with over 25 years of experience, having worked on numerous municipal, institutional, and facility infrastructure projects, including road construction, reconstruction, and maintenance. Since 2008, Andy has been a senior project manager in the Madison branch office of Ruker & Milke. He's been active in ASE for many years, including being president of the Illinois Valley branch. In addition, he is also active in the American Council of Engineering Companies of Wisconsin and serves on the State Facilities Committee. Andy is a licensed professional engineer in Wisconsin and Illinois and has leadership in energy and environmental design, green associate credential, and is an Envision sustainability professional. And last but not least, the third member of our team is Rusty Chesmore. Rusty graduated from Iowa State University with a bachelor's degree in civil engineering. Upon graduation, he joined Mead & Hunt as a project engineer, project manager on hundreds of highway and bridge projects. He currently is a vice president at Mead & Hunt, as well as business unit leader for Mead & Hunt's Midwest Transportation Services discipline, with over 30 years of experience in the industry. Rusty is a licensed professional engineer in many states where Mead & Hunt does business. He's an active member of the Wisconsin Society of Professional Engineers, American Society of Civil Engineers, Wisconsin Transportation Builders Association, and the American Council of Engineering Companies of Wisconsin. And with that, we'll begin our presentation on the Rhodes chapter of Wisconsin's Infrastructure Report Card. Thank you.
A decade later, when the federal government indicated they would not be updating the report, ASCE used the approach and methodology to publish its first report card of America's infrastructure in 1998. Subsequent national reports have been released in 2001 and every 4 years thereafter. In Wisconsin, the inaugural report card was released in 2003, followed up by a second edition in 2007. As the current team can attest to, putting together this document takes a great deal of effort, and it took until 2020 for the second report to be released after 12 months of hard work. In doing so, each of our 13 subcommittees evaluated their respective infrastructure category according to the following 8 criteria: condition, capacity, funding, future need, public safety, operation and maintenance, innovation, and resilience. Upon completion of our evaluations, recommendations were made as to how to raise the grades of Wisconsin's infrastructure. As I indicated, countless hours were devoted to this endeavor. Our road subcommittee alone collected data representing 115,000 miles of roadways in Wisconsin, from interstate highways to local town roads. And with that, I will turn it over to Rusty as we take a closer look as to how we determined our grade.
Thanks, Brian. I will start by discussing roadway conditions. The chart on this slide is showing a trend of deteriorating roadway conditions since 2013, especially local roads. This data comes from ratings of state roadways by WSDOT and counties. WSDOT uses a rating system called PCI, which takes into consideration not only the roadway surface, but also the base under the pavement. Counties use a rating system called PACER that primarily analyzes the pavement only. You may have noticed many state highways are getting resurfaced to quickly repair some dire conditions. This is a relatively quick fix and a least costly repair alternative. However, it might be better if some of these roadways were completely reconstructed to repair the base as well as the pavement, but that would take more time and funding that isn't readily available. It would also focus repairs on just a few roadways instead of the many roadways that can be repaired with resurfacing. However, the resurfacing repairs won't last long on roadways that really should have been completely reconstructed, which could lead to a large number of pavement failures in the near future. Prior to the one-time funding increase provided in the last budget, WSDOT predicted a 50% increase in roads rated poor or below in the next 10 years. 19% of Wisconsin's rural roads are rated in poor condition, which is 16th highest in the nation. There is a cost to Wisconsin drivers due to poor roadway conditions, which include wear and tear on vehicles, wasted fuel due to congestion, and the cost due to crashes. This amounts to $6 billion statewide and $2,000 annually to each driver in Madison and Milwaukee. The traffic capacity of Wisconsin's roadways is a concern. The value of lost time and wasted fuel due to congested traffic in Wisconsin is approximately $1.9 billion each year. The chart on this slide shows the hours lost and annual cost to each driver in some of Wisconsin's major metropolitan areas due to congestion. Vehicle miles traveled in Wisconsin is in an upward trend. 29% of urban interstates experience congestion during peak hours, and this will certainly increase with increased traffic. A couple organizations that conduct nationwide rankings of each state's transportation infrastructure ranked Wisconsin quite low. 38th in the nation by the Reason Foundation, and 32nd by U.S. News and World Report. Funding to improve Wisconsin's transportation infrastructure appears to have been lacking in recent years. The chart on this slide shows fuel tax revenues in brown, registration fees in tan, and all other fees dedicated to transportation infrastructure in blue. As you can see, the funding level has been quite flat since 2014. During Governor Walker's first term, he appointed a blue ribbon panel of transportation experts to produce several funding scenarios for the future of the state's transportation infrastructure. This committee was called the Wisconsin Transportation Finance and Policy Commission. And the scenario we have been following since 2014 has been the disinvestment scenario, much to the disappointment of this panel. Here are some facts concerning transportation funding in Wisconsin. Investment has not met needs or matched inflation since 2006 when gas tax indexing was abolished. Since 2006, the construction cost index has increased 48% and fuel tax purchasing power decreased 20%. During this time, investment increased 30% with the use of bonding, but after subtracting the debt service the state pays on the bonding money, the net increase is only 13%. The Wisconsin Transportation Finance and Policy Committee recommended a $480 million annual increase over a 10-year period starting in 2014 to produce a robust transportation system in Wisconsin. This didn't happen, but Wisconsin did approve a one-time increase in transportation funding of $465 million for the 2020-2021 biennium. Prior to this latest increase in transportation funding, WisDOT reported that a $180 million annual increase over the next 10 years would be required to maintain our current pavement conditions. The chart on this slide shows how Wisconsin compares to surrounding states in regard to annual costs for each vehicle owner. Our gas tax may be a bit higher than some other states, but our vehicle registration fees are much less. So overall, we pay less to drive our vehicles in Wisconsin than drivers do in other states. Now that concludes my portion of the presentation, so I will now turn it over to Brian Udovich to continue on.
Thanks, Rusty. As transportation engineers, we must strive to ensure that our roadways are as safe as possible. However, with distracted drivers on the road, as well as numerous different types of vehicles occupying the same facilities, cars, trucks, agricultural equipment, cyclists, and ATVs, UTVs, it is getting harder and harder to do so. In fact, based on the 5-year data from 2013 to 2017 made available to us at the beginning of our study, fatal crashes are on the rise. Actually, the overall fatality rate on Wisconsin roadways is less than the national average, but the fatality rate on rural roadways is nearly twice the national average. There are typically 3 predominant factors associated with fatal crashes: driver behavior, vehicle characteristics, and roadway features. Roadway features such as the number of lanes, lane width, lighting, pavement markings, rumble strips, shoulders, guardrail, median barriers, and intersection design contribute to 1/3 of fatal crashes. These crashes in which roadway features are a factor had an economic cost of $1.8 billion in Wisconsin in 2016 alone due to work and or household productivity losses, property damage, medical and rehabilitation costs, legal fees, congestion, and emergency services. However, the good news is that there are programs in place like the Highway Safety Improvement Program and High Risk Rural Road Program that municipalities can utilize to enhance safety by implementing improvements to roadway geometry. While local municipalities, cities, towns, and villages maintain the local roads, the Wisconsin County Highway Association has a unique relationship with the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, in that county highway departments perform maintenance not only on their county trunk highways, but also the state trunk highways and the interstate system. There are a number of mechanisms in place that allow this format to work so well. For instance, performance-based maintenance contracts are utilized to seal coat, crack fill, and shoulder highways, as well as perform bridge maintenance. Routine maintenance contracts allow for mowing roadsides, clearing brush, and controlling invasive species. Traffic maintenance contracts are in place to maintain roadway signs and pavement markings, while winter maintenance contracts provide a means for plowing snow in the winter. WSDOT has been trying to maintain pavements in good to fair condition by implementing pavement preservation techniques, such as pulverizing, milling, and overlay projects. In 2020, highway maintenance allocations increased by 1.7%, but still fell short 26% of the demand generated by the DOT level of service model. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andy, who will wrap up our presentation discussing with you the innovation and resiliency of Wisconsin roadways, as well as our recommendations to raise the grade.
Thank you, Brian. As Brian mentioned, the last two criteria that I'm going to cover are innovation and resilience. Maximizing existing revenue is a priority for leaders of all infrastructure sectors in Wisconsin, and WSDOT is no different. They have implemented numerous policies and practices designed to stretch available dollars, such as the DTSD, or Division of Transportation Systems Development, and their development of a program to foster innovative ideas in the areas of construction management, design development, data collection, maintenance, and asset management. Their success has won an award from the FHWA as part of their Everyday Counts program. Some of their implemented innovations have included the field use of iPads for CEI and bridge inspections, continual movement to a paperless environment, and expanded use of InfraWorks, to name a few. Another example is the implementation of dynamic part-time shoulder use to add capacity only when needed. This practice keeps the shoulders intact for most hours of the day and may help to defer major and costly widening projects. Yet another example is the adoption of uniform material selection policies. An example of this is pavement markings. By providing consistent marking, DOT can enhance motorist safety and will result in the most efficient usage of dollars for both the project as well as maintenance. Other innovations include right time treatments, balancing preservation and expansion, value engineering, reusing materials on site, cost reduction incentives, performance-based maintenance, replace in kind, and Themix Prime, which is a revised investment strategy over the traditional 3R, or resurfacing, restoration, and rehabilitation program, to reduce the number of poor pavement lane miles and at the same time increase the number of lane miles that are in good condition. One way that WSDOT has improved the resiliency of the state's roadways is the development of Traffic Incident Management, or TIM. This is a collaborative effort of public safety and transportation agencies. TIM consists of a planned and coordinated multidisciplinary process to detect, respond to, and clear traffic incidents so that traffic flow may be restored as safely and quickly as possible. Effective TIM reduces the duration and impacts of traffic incidents and improves the safety of motorists, crash victims, and emergency responders. With that, I'm going to cover some of the recommendations to raise the grade in Wisconsin. The poor condition of the roadways in Wisconsin causes increased travel time, wear and tear on vehicles, and crashes, with many resulting in fatalities. This results in billions of dollars of increased expenses for motorists due to lost time, repairs to vehicles, and healthcare costs. Steps can be taken to remedy some of these issues, such as the following: make needed geometric repairs, create sufficient clear zones, and update traffic operations where needed to improve the safety of the state's roadways and reduce congestion. Create an integrated multimodal transportation system, especially in urban areas, to help improve congestion and provide more transportation opportunities. Enact many of the funding recommendations provided in 2013 by the Wisconsin Transportation Finance and Policy Commission, including raising the state gas tax, adopt a new mileage-based registration fee, increase annual registration fees, increase the fee for an 8-year license, eliminate sales tax exemption on the trade-in value of a vehicle, reinstitute gas tax indexing, seek approval for tolling of some freeways, and allow regional transportation authorities to raise funds through local taxes. Another recommendation is to increase the federal motor fuel tax while pursuing a more efficient funding system that utilizes vehicle miles traveled to determine user fees. And lastly, develop a more balanced maintenance, rehabilitation, and reconstruction approach to the state's roadways to provide the most optimum cost-effective life cycle for pavement structures. Wisconsin's maintenance spending per lane mile is relatively low, while capital and administrative spending per lane mile are quite high. Thank you for your time.
Okay, the next category is bridges. And Tony Castle is the lead author. You can see that the bridge icon, the bridge category was given a C+. Next slide, please. The two authors are Tony Castle and Mike Arnold. Tony is the current president of the American Society of Civil Engineers Wisconsin Section Southeast Branch, and one of the co-authors of this chapter. He graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and received a Master of Science in Structural Engineering from MSOE. He is currently employed as a structural engineer at AECOM in their Milwaukee office. Tony has received many awards, Outstanding Young Civil Engineer in Private Practice and the 2017 Young Engineer of the Year by ASCE Wisconsin section. Mike Arnold is a co-author of this chapter. He graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is a senior structural engineer at AECOM in their Milwaukee office, with a primary focus on bridges. Mike's service with ASCE over the years has included being the president of the Southeast Branch, and he received an Individual Merit Award, Engineer in Consulting Practice. Let's now move to the next slide and the presentation on bridges.
Good afternoon. This is the presentation for the bridge chapter of the 2020 ASCE Wisconsin Infrastructure Report Card. As you can see on the slide, Wisconsin's bridges received a grade of a C+. This means that our bridges are currently adequate for today's standard, but will require thoughtful planning to address future needs. This grade is a slight improvement from the 2007 report card, C, as well as the National Report Card Bridge Chapter, C, which was released a few months ago. However, this isn't an indication that more improvement isn't needed. In fact, as you will learn throughout today's presentation, our state's bridges are in danger of deteriorating at an exponential rate if we continue to do nothing to address the aging infrastructure. When comparing the bridges in our state to the other infrastructure categories, the C plus puts bridges in the middle of the pack. However, when you combine this grade with our other transportation grades such as roads D plus and transit D plus, the traditional surface transportation chapters definitely rate at the bottom of the pack. This is an important factor to keep in mind, as typically transportation funding combines several of these categories. This next slide gives an outline of the criteria that each chapter investigated. The capacity and condition portion of the chapter assesses the current state of the particular infrastructure category and its capability to handle current capacities. The funding and future need criteria looks at how the infrastructure is currently being funded, if it's adequate, and if not, ways that it falls short. The operation and maintenance criteria look at the unique ways and techniques that our infrastructure is being operated and maintained. Public safety obviously looks at the extent that the public safety is jeopardized by the condition of the infrastructure and what could be the consequences of failure. Resilience and innovation look at new and innovative techniques, materials, and delivery methods to improve infrastructure and the system's capability to prevent incidences and failures. Also, this looks at how quickly can the infrastructure recover and reconstitute critical services. So with that, let's dive into the first two categories, capacity and condition. As of 2018, 1 in 13 of the 14,275 bridges in the state of Wisconsin were labeled as structurally deficient. A structurally deficient designation means a critical load carrying element of the bridge is found to be in poor condition due to deterioration or damage requiring significant maintenance, rehabilitation, or replacement. As you can see on this slide, Wisconsin's 7.4% of structurally deficient bridges is slightly below the national value, 7.6%. However, as the national percentage has steadily decreased over the past decade, Wisconsin's value has remained relatively constant. This stagnation is an indication that Wisconsin has shifted its funding priority away from transportation infrastructure. Another useful indicator is the percentage of the state's total deck area that belongs to structurally deficient bridges. 4.2% of total bridge area in Wisconsin belong to deficient bridges in 2018, which is below the national average of 5.4%. This is an indication that higher volume bridges are less likely to be structurally deficient in Wisconsin. As of the end of 2018, the average age of a bridge in Wisconsin was just under 40 years old, which is slightly lower than the national average, just under 45 years. An important fact to keep in mind when considering this average bridge age is that the majority of these bridges were designed for a lifespan of 50 years. So when the bridges were initially designed, the intent was for them to only last 50 years. For reference, today we design new bridges to have a lifespan of 75 years. So obviously we have increased the life expectancy of new bridges, but we cannot assume the same life expectancy for existing bridges. Another interesting tidbit to pull from this pie chart is that nearly 1 in 3 bridges in the state of Wisconsin are 49 years or older. Therefore, a significant number of bridges are at or near the end of their designed life and either currently need or soon will need major rehabilitation or replacement. Although aging infrastructure may not concern some, the key factor to keep in mind is that deterioration can be a snowball or exponential effect. An older bridge that is currently operating satisfactorily can quickly deteriorate beyond repair, and it's hard to predict when and how fast the deterioration will occur. Have you ever seen or come across a bridge that has a sign similar to the one depicted in this slide? This is a typical bridge load posting sign. Some bridges can only carry traffic up to a certain weight, requiring load restrictions to be posted on the bridge. These load restrictions are typically imposed because the bridge is not structurally adequate to carry a normal design load. In 2018, about 1 in 19 bridges in Wisconsin required such restrictions. While this rate is slightly lower than the national average of 1 in 10, it is important to keep in mind Posted bridges can dramatically increase driving time for larger and heavy vehicles serving emergency response, public transit, and movement of goods. In particular, the longer our goods must travel, the more costly they are. Therefore, it is important to limit bridges with weight restrictions by improving the bridge's structural capacity through rehabilitation and replacement projects as much as possible. 1 in 19 bridges may not sound like many, but you would be surprised how many bridges are crossed in a normal commute. Now with that, I'll pass on the presentation to my colleague, Mike Arnold, to discuss the funding and future need of bridges in Wisconsin.
So now that Tony has covered the condition of the bridges in our state, and now we need to talk about how are we paying for the maintenance and improvement of these bridges. So in Wisconsin, transportation and bridge funding comes from primarily two sources, and that is 24% from federal funding, 56% from state funding, both of which are covered or contributed to with gas taxes. State also provides transportation funds through vehicle registration fees. And then the remainder comes from bonding or borrowing, and also from local funding. Just to go through a breakdown of these funding sources, the federal gas tax is currently at 18.4 cents per gallon, but this has not been raised since 1993, and it's also not indexed for inflation. So what this means is that we're trying to pay for bridge projects now in 2021, basically using 1993 dollars. And so there's a big disadvantage to that. We're just not getting, the dollar is not going as far as now as it did in 1993, obviously. The Wisconsin gas tax is currently at 30.9 cents per gallon and was formerly indexed for inflation. However, in 2005, the state legislature eliminated this indexing. So again, we have a situation where we are trying to pay for projects in today's dollars at a funding level that's a decade and a half old, basically. One thing to note about the way Wisconsin funds transportation and bridge projects is that the Wisconsin Transportation Fund is a segregated fund. And what that means is that through a constitutional amendment passed in 2014, the Wisconsin Transportation Fund cannot be allocated toward any other use besides transportation. And so it can't be used to, contribute to school funding or to go into the general fund. So that's a big benefit. That means that that money that's raised through registration fees and gas taxes is truly being used to maintain and fund bridge projects in Wisconsin. Part of the challenge with funding, though, is that there's really there's an anticipation and the current recognition that we're falling short. So in 2019, a report by the American Road and Transportation Builders Association indicated that nearly 2,000 bridges in Wisconsin are in need of repairs, and that the price tag on those repairs is approximately $1.4 billion. So as we see shortfalls in transportation funding, and also the incidence of higher hybrid and electric vehicle use, where fuel taxes aren't necessary, fuel tax revenue is not being generated. Over time we're going to see that that the funding level isn't going to keep up with that 1.4 billion that we need, and in the meantime, the condition of our bridges is getting worse, as Tony alluded to earlier. One of the ways that Wisconsin covers the gap in funding is through bonding, and which is essentially borrowing money, and that helps to to get new projects on the new projects done, and also get maintenance done. But it's not a sustainable source of revenue, because you're not only are you borrowing, but now you're also using revenue that's generated for transportation projects just to pay off that debt. And so right now we have 20% of transportation generated revenue going toward debt service, and that's actually up from 10% in 2006. So the percentage that we're paying toward debt service is going up over time, or as time goes along. So in order to address this long-term funding crisis, we really need to look at various funding sources and figure out ways that we can create a more sustainable funding source. One of the topics that's been raised recently is a higher gas tax to help cover the shortage. Also, use-based fees, so a fee based on the number of miles driven every year by personal drivers and commercial drivers. This is an approach that helps to balance the increasing percentage of electric and hybrid vehicles on the road, which use a very small amount of gasoline compared to gasoline powered vehicles. And also, tolling is another option that helps to pay for stretches of roadway, heavily traveled stretches of freeway, and kind of a use-based fee, but it's more locally directed, I guess you could say.
So, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, the operation and maintenance criteria categories investigate the unique ways and techniques that our infrastructure is being operated and maintained. A key example of this is the Wisconsin Structures Asset Management System, WISAMS. WISAMS is a software tool developed in-house by the Wisconsin DOT Bureau of Structures. It's a planning tool which analyzes current structure condition based on information collected from routine biennial bridge inspections, projects future bridge deterioration, and recommends structure work at the appropriate time. Innovation and resiliency are an example of categories that I thought contributed to the improvement of the bridge chapter from the 2007 Wisconsin report. Over the past decade, the Wisconsin DOT Bureau of Structures has implemented the accelerated bridge construction techniques. The ABC initiatives utilize different methods of project delivery and construction to reduce schedule, on-site construction time, and public impact. Some of the benefits of using ABC methods includes minimized traffic impacts, increased safety during construction, increased long-term durability with shop fabrication, and reduced impacts on environmentally sensitive areas. Some examples of these techniques include prefabricated bridge elements, as you can see on the slide, as well as lateral sliding, where a portion of the bridge is built on-site away from traffic and then slid into place over a night or a weekend. Per Wisconsin legislation, the design, bid, build project delivery method has been the only method allowed for state-funded transportation projects. However, recently legislation allowed for pilot programs to utilize the design build method. Unlike the design bid build process, the design build process allows the design and construction phases to overlap, reducing project delivery time. The design build method generally increases the design builder's risk and reduces the owner's risk. Several policies and standard practices help make Wisconsin bridges more durable and resilient, especially with regards to heavy de-icing salt usage. Epoxy-coated reinforcement is standard on all bridge decks and substructures exposed to these de-icing chemicals As you can see in the picture, it's kind of the green color to the reinforcement. There's select use of stainless steel deck reinforcements being used on structures with significantly high redecking costs, specifying the use of high performance concrete in large costly structures improves freeze-thaw durability, prolonging deck life. The use of polymer overlays in Wisconsin has become more prevalent as a preventative maintenance activity. The practice of preventative polymer overlay application is intended to protect the bridge deck surface from the chloride infiltration, while at the same time increasing friction on the riding surface.
So now that we've covered all the various aspects of condition, funding, need for funding, and also some of the innovative techniques that Wisconsin is using, we have compiled some recommendations to raise the report card grade for bridges in Wisconsin. The first is to address short-term funding needs by raising the fuel tax and also reinstating indexing to keep pace with inflation. This will help kind of cover that gap in the short term and also make sure that we're keeping that funding at the same kind of keeping pace with the decreasing value of the dollar. Also, we would encourage policymakers and engineers in Wisconsin to continue to develop and utilize alternative project delivery methods to help keep project costs lower, and also to expedite repairs and replacement of bridges, which helps to save money in the long run. Finally, we would encourage policymakers, lawmakers to continue to study and implement pilot programs for mileage-based user fees and toll roads to help provide a sustainable long-term funding source for our bridges in Wisconsin. So with that, Tony and I would like to thank everyone for attending and listening to our presentation today. And at the end of the seminar, you'll have the opportunity to ask Tony and I any questions you have about what we presented on. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian Udovich and your team, and Tony Castle and your team for very...
This is the presentation for the...
Oh my God, no. For very informative presentations. Both your roads and bridges presentations and the report card chapters you wrote help us better understand the current condition of Wisconsin's roads and bridges. After hearing from our panel, we welcome your participation in the conversation about how to raise the grade for roads and bridges. Now we will transition to our panel. First is Debbie Jackson. I somehow missed your title here, Debbie. The Transportation Executive Director of the Transportation Development Association of Wisconsin. The Transportation Development Association is a statewide organization of 400 plus transportation stakeholders committed to a safe, modern, interconnected transportation network that will support a robust economy and enhance the quality of life for everyone in Wisconsin. Debbie Jackson assumed the role of Executive Director of the Transportation Development Association of Wisconsin after more than 15 years with the organization. In addition to her vast experience in association management and transportation advocacy, Jackson has a business background. She leverages the breadth and depth of her experience, along with her knowledge of the membership and mission of TDA, to be a strong voice for transportation infrastructure in Wisconsin. Let's welcome Debbie Jackson.
Well, thank you so much. And I want to thank ASCE Wisconsin for the work that they do on this report card. and the work that their members do in our communities every day. It's also important to thank the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin for highlighting infrastructure and giving a platform to talk about, as Carol mentioned in her introduction, just how important infrastructure is to our daily lives. Now, the report card points out that Wisconsin has struggled with coming up with a long-term sustainable plan for transportation funding for decades. Now, we're not alone, we're not special. This is true of states across the nation, and it's true about the federal government. If you've been following the infrastructure debate in DC, once the news coverage moved beyond, let's say, the definition of infrastructure, the second question was, well, how are we going to pay for this? Now, this perennial transportation question, how are we going to fund transportation, I think has become even more significant after recent announcements. A couple months ago, GM announced that they're going to phase out internal combustion vehicles in 2035. Ford estimates that they're going to have 40% of their vehicles that they sell in 2030 are going to be electric. So this is a game changer. The major source for for the trust fund at both the state and the federal level is the gas tax. So as we were looking at the recommendations, and I'm talking about this, this does not mean that the gas tax is not still an excellent way to produce revenue today. And in the short to medium term. But Wisconsin does need to get serious about what happens after the gas tax. Now, we enacted a couple of vehicle registration surcharges a couple bienniums ago or a biennium ago for electric and hybrid vehicles, which would be a stopgap, but it's probably not going to be sufficient. So as we work on addressing the issues that the report card highlights so well, I think there's a couple things to keep in mind. And I think that they're in the presentations, but I just want to bring them to the forefront. In order to make meaningful headway with this issue, it's going to require a partnership between the federal, state, and local governments. If you look at what we spend on highways, roads, bridges, and transit, what we call our surface transportation programs, about 25% of the funding comes from the federal government, 40% comes from the state, and 35% comes from our local governments. So we sometimes forget that local governments are not just a significant part of providing transportation services like the road in front of our house, transit, ports, airports, but they also play a really significant role in how we fund transportation. And I'm glad Kyle Christensen is on the panel. The next thing I would point out is, there were a lot of good recommendations put on the board. And I think we need to keep an attitude that we should have all these options on the table, and we should talk about all of them. And when we say we're open to all options for the discussion of fixing our problem, it should be all options to raise revenue, but also all options to look at providing our services more efficiently. I hope I'm not stealing Kyle's thunder, but the counties are also doing innovative work with DOT to get simple projects out the door sooner. So these are all things that we need to look at. The last thing, and I'm going to wrap up here, is I would just like to point out is that we did make some progress in the last budget. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, because there were some elected officials who carried some water for us. And I think that, if we need their help again, we should acknowledge what they've done for us in the past. So we did have an increase to the titling fee. We had a $10 registration fee, and those dollars are helping us out in this budget going forward. As I think Rusty was pointing out, these fees are not going to grow like a percentage-based sales tax or a percentage-based income tax. And so, you know, so we didn't get where we needed to go. I would say in the last budget, we maybe slowed the decline of our system. We did not improve it. We still have ways to go. And I appreciate, you know, that you're raising this issue, because transportation is the cornerstone of our economy and our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debbie Jackson. Your comment about all options need to be on the table all the time, and we're not where we need to be is right on target. Next, we'll hear from Mark Kucinich, Chief Executive Officer of the Associated General Contractors of Greater Milwaukee. AGC GM is a construction trade association representing over 300 construction contractors and industry suppliers throughout southeastern Wisconsin. The AGC provides its members with professional services in education, career development, safety, and industry networking, along with representing the industry in public policy, civic, and economic development issues. Prior to AGC, GM Mark worked for 8 years as president and CEO of WRTP/Big Step. And I look forward to knowing what that stands for. Mark currently serves on the board of directors of both Employment Milwaukee and WRTP/Big Step. Let's welcome Mark Kucinich.
Good afternoon, Carol. Good afternoon to everyone who's engaged in this conversation. It's been very interesting so far. So that's a nice introduction to the association I work for. I'll start by just saying part of the reason I'm joining this conversation is to talk about workforce development. And as you can see from my resume, I spent a good deal of my career working in the workforce development realm, and largely within the construction field, both heavy highway, commercial construction, which is how I ultimately ended up with the AGC. So my comments here are going to be a complement to or a supplement to the rest of the conversation. If we had to do a report card for the state of the nation's workforce or the state of Wisconsin's workforce, I'm afraid that when we look at some key indicators, we would find ourselves equally as frustrated with the lack of investment, the lack of long-term planning. Most people who deal in transportation have a scientific understanding of the costs and how materials are made and how they're built. And so one of the things that I think of when I think of the workforce development questions is that because employment is something that's common to everyone in some way or another, we all have certain opinions about what might be happening. But I can assure you, if you've been around long enough, you're aware that we're in a generational demographic shift that we've been talking about for nearly 20, almost 30 years now. And as Wisconsin's chief economist, Dennis Winters, will point out, if you look at some of his research, the number of counties that have a working age population has been diminishing and will continue to diminish. So we have some structural problems in Wisconsin around workforce in general. But let me just say, specific to the construction or energy sector, my national association indicates every year we do a survey of challenges that our contractors are facing. And 54% of those firms report difficulty finding the qualified workforce they need. The Global Energy Talent Index is at 60% concern with their workforce needs, as opposed to 48% in 2019. The short story is, while the pandemic may have created some different workforce challenges or employment challenges that we're now starting to hear about, this was a problem that was pre-existing the pandemic and will continue to go on without a more substantial approach to how we're going to build a skilled and technical workforce. Whether that's project engineers and engineers across the gamut. In my case, my comments here are really directed toward the skilled trades, and the actual infrastructure builders, those people who are actually going to go out in the field and operate heavy equipment. They're going to do the wiring. They're going to do all of the things that we're talking about we need to do. Somebody has to do it. Technology will not solve the problem of doing most of the work that needs to get done, at least not in the next 5 to 10 years. So we need to do something about that piece. And I'm not going to get into a great depth on the conversation, but in my role serving at Employ Milwaukee, which is a local workforce board, there's 11 of them across the state. They're responsible for public investments into training. The WRTP Big Step acronym, it takes 5 minutes to tell you what that all meant, but it is a nonprofit workforce development organization that has been working on this issue at small scale. My biggest challenge there was we could never scale our workforce development efforts because the funding wasn't sufficient, whether that was coming through the Department of Transportation or the Department of Workforce Development. So with the potential of an infrastructure package, there's two things I wanted to leave on the table for some discussion if it's desirable. I am working in a national coalition. I sit on a industry recovery panel. And in fact, we will be meeting with the Undersecretary of Transportation next week, Tuesday, I believe, the 8th, or maybe it's the following week actually, to talk about a proposal that nationally, there are many of us who work within the industry or work within the education and training field who believe that you cannot make an investment into the hard infrastructure unless you look at the current state of our workforce and concern yourself with the kind of training, the kind of skills development that we need. Much like the roads and the bridges, these investments will last a couple of decades at least, but without substantially investing in our future workforce, without substantially investing in roads, our workforce will continue to erode at the highest skill level. And that's regardless of the other demographic challenges that we look at, which is the aging of the population, the need to bring more diversity and inclusion into all sectors of the economy, but in particular, our infrastructure builders. And lastly, when you consider the fact that for those of you who live in Milwaukee County, we're not going to have fireworks this year. And that isn't because there's not enough fireworks or because there's COVID, but if you read the article in the Journal Sentinel, we can't find enough seasonal workers to just do the work that needs to get done. So when you consider those dynamics that are at work, in my mind, talking about infrastructure is a great exercise, but if we can't even shoot off fireworks, how in the hell are we going to build an energy grid or an infrastructure that's worthy of the 21st century? So I look forward to being a small part of this panel. I appreciate the invitation to be with you this afternoon. And I'm enjoyed several of these panels or these conversations and look forward to further working with you.
Mark, thank you very much for your talk and information about workforce development. Our next speaker is Kyle Christensen. Kyle is the Communications Director of Governmental Affairs for the Wisconsin Counties Association. As the Governmental Affairs Director, Kyle leads Wisconsin Counties Association lobbying efforts both in Madison and Washington, D.C. In this role, he manages the association's lobbyist and outreach division, and as the association's chief lobbyist, he is responsible for overseeing all legislative and regulatory activities impacting county government, and for establishing strategies to achieve successful legislative and administrative outcomes. Before joining the WCA in 2012, Kyle worked as a policy analyst for the nonpartisan Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance, where he focused on state and local fiscal policy. He's a University of Wisconsin La Crosse graduate and holds a degree in political science and public administration, with a specialty in public policy implementation and evaluation. Let's welcome Kyle Christensen.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to your group for hosting a series on this very, very important topic. Before I get into really county government and its specific role as it relates to the state's infrastructure, which I think we've heard over the last hour or so is really in dire need of additional funding and resources. I want to talk about kind of how we at the association view our relationship with the state's infrastructure. And when we think about this, I think if you go back decades, there was a belief that there was a private sector in this state and there was a public sector in this state. Never shall the two sides meet unless there's some regulatory issue. But I think that concept has evolved considerably in recent years and really over the past decade, where we've realized that the only way that the state is going to succeed, and the only way that local governments are going to succeed is if the business community and the private sector also succeeds. And I think there's no better example of where the public sector and private sector can come together to do good for the state other than the state's infrastructure. So I think we look at this not only from the perspective of counties having their own roads and having to maintain those roads as just a function, a core service of government, but also what's the macro impact of roads on the state's economy and the state's 5.5 million people. So when we think of county governments, it's important to remember that counties are an arm of the state. And what that really means is that counties are the local delivery arm of state services. The state decides what service or policy they're going to implement. And ultimately, it's the counties that carry out that policy at the local level. There's no better example than that than an issue that's already been touched on, and that's the unique relationship between the state and counties as it relates to road maintenance. Wisconsin is the only state in the country that contracts with county governments and not their own respective DOTs to provide maintenance not only in the state highway system, but also the interstate system. So we have this really unique relationship between the state and counties when it comes to the state's total infrastructure, regardless of who is primarily responsible for it. And that leads to a real strong dependence on county government, on state resources to adequately maintain our state's thousands of bridges and hundreds of thousands of road miles. So if we look at counties and how we accomplish that, it's important to note that the state provides counties aids to essentially assist them maintain the local infrastructure. But maybe bigger than that, it's important to remember that while many county services are mandated by the state says, counties, you must do A, B, C, and D. Road maintenance is not one of them. So if there's ever budget crunches at the local level, one of the only places that counties are able to cut their budgets to essentially fund the mandated services is in infrastructure. So our road budgets are connected to every other part of the county budget. So when we think of things like maybe there's a reduction in state aid for juvenile corrections, we don't necessarily tie that to infrastructure, but that can easily have an impact on a county's ability to adequately invest in their infrastructure. And I think a decline in state funding to local governments has led to some of the very dire circumstances that we have today that we've talked about. I mean, right now we have counties with road replacement schedules of over 100 years. So what that means is that with their current budgets, a road has to last 100 years before there's adequate funding to actually repair or replace that road. Well, I think everyone on the panel, we don't have to be an engineer to know that roads don't last 100 years. So what we're doing is we're essentially delaying maintenance activities because we don't have the funds to do that, which is shortening the lifespan of the road, but we're asking the road to last twice as long as its actual lifespan. So it's a cycle that's not sustainable. I think it's a cycle that's not only applicable to county highways, but also town roads, municipal streets, the interstate system. And I think that really circles back to this report that really shows what we've known for a long time, which is we don't have adequate investment. Now, I know we've talked a lot about revenue, and clearly we have a revenue problem when it comes to transportation, but I was so glad that Debbie mentioned some of the efficiencies that counties are working on as well. We realize that we need to also be part of this solution. And part of the solution, the majority of the solution is new revenue, but we also have to stretch our local dollars further. So we're working very closely with the Wisconsin Department of Transportation to try to implement new efficiencies, eliminate red tape, so that we can stretch those local dollars further. And ultimately, I think that's going to be, hopefully part of this long-term solution. Efficiencies on one side and new revenue on the other side. The other thing that I think is important, and Debbie also mentioned this, was that we did make progress in the last state budget. For the first time in a long time, we had additional revenues increased at the state level for transportation. While that's really good news, in some ways, I think it took the pressure off, leaders here in Madison and in Washington, D.C. to an extent, to do more in this budget. I was just in the Capitol a few hours ago, and they were saying, well, the transportation budget's going to come up in a few weeks, and it'll be an easy budget because we did the hard stuff last time. That's not the message that I think we want state lawmakers hearing, right? What we want them hearing is the exact message that we've heard on this call, and talking about the report and really the reality of Wisconsin's state infrastructure. And I guess, just in closing, what I'd say and why I'm so appreciative of this group and what you're doing is because if we look around the country at what other states have done to be successful in raising additional revenues for transportation, maybe surprisingly, the groups that have led that effort are not typical transportation related groups, right? It's groups like the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. It's groups like the independent businesses. It's groups like the workforce development folks that were really the tip of the spear in those states, saying, hey, this is about a lot more than just roads or bridges. This is about the quality of life and attracting the talent necessary that we need in the state to address some of the demographic challenges. So I think while groups like yours and others may sometimes think of transportation as kind of a maybe a second rung issue on the priority list, it is groups like yours and others like you that are ultimately going to be the reason that Wisconsin finally takes this problem seriously and finds solutions. So thank you for what you're doing. Sincerely appreciate it.
Kyle, thank you so much for that. Such good information, such good perspectives. The last panelist is Professor Habib Tabatabai. I have known him for a long time and went to his website and saw the list of bridge research that he's been involved in, and wanted him to come and let all of us know what his department is doing in the whole area of research and innovation that is so important. So Professor Tabatabai is the professor of structural engineering and director of the Structural Engineering Laboratory in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at UW-Milwaukee. He received his PhD in civil engineering from the University of Florida in 1987. His research areas include durability, repair, and reliability of bridges. Next slide, please, and Professor Tabatabai.
Thank you very much, Carol. I am just going to touch a little bit about some of the work that we are doing, as well as other universities and research institutions doing across the country in related to challenge we face with bridges. One aspect, and with the world that we live in, we look at sustainable materials. We want to develop methodologies, new techniques, new materials that are more sustainable for construction. We look at our construction materials, ways to make them have a less carbon footprint, have less embodied energy, and be more environment friendly. We want to use more beneficially use recycled and industrial byproducts into materials, not just as a way of increasing the use, beneficial use, but also for improving properties of materials. And we are working on using, developing and using advanced materials, high performance materials, not only in high performance steel, high performance concrete, ultra high performance concrete, those that give us potential for a much longer service life of bridges. Now, in terms of longer service life, aside from materials, we do need to increase those service lives, as was mentioned earlier, a few years ago, maybe a couple decades ago, we were talking about design service life of 50 years. Now it's 75 years. For major structures, 120 years. Things are pushing towards a 100-year design life. We need not only the materials, but other techniques to preserve our structures. There is a lot of work is done on preservation and repair and rehab strategies. One very important rule is that if you start your preservation when the structure is new, when you don't think you need it, that's the best time to start it. And that will help you lengthen the service life of the bridge substantially. It is a lot more effective than repairs later on in its life. We also need to better understand how materials deteriorate, and there's a lot of research going in that direction. One other important thing is resilient structures. We face increasing threats from natural hazards, wind, earthquakes, and floods because of a number of factors. We need to make those survivable. This doesn't mean we know that there is always a force that will destroy any structure. We have to make sure that we minimize the loss, especially loss of life. And we want to make sure that if there was going to be a failure, that it is going to be localized and not catastrophic. And with all of those comes together, there is a lot of research being done. The challenge is how we translate that to facts on the ground. And that needs education, that needs technology transfer. Some of the funding agencies recognize that Wisconsin DOT in its research funding requires implementation plans. But this has to trickle not only into new designs, into maintenance policy, not on the state level, but also on the county level and local bridges and so on. So there is a lot of things that still need to be done, but there are a lot of exciting things that are being done as well in terms of research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Habib. I think we have so many possible items for questions. And now it's time for our audience. And I see that there are many, many questions in the chat. So Morgan, why don't you start and let us know who has the first question.
Sure. We're going to start with someone that had their hand raised during the program. Marge Palion, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask the question, you can start us off.
I do not have a question. I'm sorry.
All right, never mind then. We will start on a question from Lisa at the beginning of the Rhodes presentation, I believe. Lisa asked, what is being done to address climate change as you design and repair roads and bridges? Cement that sequesters carbon, plan for alternative transit, those sort of things.
Lisa, did Lisa, was that her question? Was that your question, Lisa? You are muted. Okay, who would you like to direct the question to?
Oh, well, I'm not sure.
Maybe I'll open it up. Who would like to respond to Lisa's question?
I can take a stab at part of it. I know Dr. Tabatabai kind of alluded to some of that in his brief presentation in terms of from the structural side on bridges and some of the materials that are being used for bridge construction. I guess I can take a, steer it down at least the road perspective. I mean, I know that when asphalt pavements are at least designed nowadays, historically they were hot mix asphalts. There are other methodologies that are being used now. There are pavements that are considered warm mix asphalts or cold mix asphalts even that I think are reducing the carbon footprint. They don't fire up the asphalt to as high a temperature and require less energy to produce those mixes. So they're not used in all situations, but on some roadways, that is one methodology that's being used to reduce the carbon footprint when asphalt pavements are being constructed.
Okay, anyone else want to respond? Or then Lisa, if you want to ask the next question, I think we have quite a few, so we'll keep going. Morgan.
Oh,
I'm
sorry.
sorry. I'm sorry. I said Lisa. I'm sorry.
No worries. Okay, this next question is from Louise, who asked, are the Wisconsin Department of Transportation weigh stations along our freeways being used? If so, do they help pavement overweight loads that increase deterioration of the roadbed?
Anyone want to respond to that?
I'm not super knowledgeable about the weigh stations, but that is my understanding as to why they do exist, is to try to keep, legal loads on the roads, because I was trying to read some of the questions during the chat, and that is exactly accurate in that I'll give the example in terms of roadways are, when an asphalt pavement or a concrete pavement for that matter is designed adequately, there's actually a science to it. There's a pavement design involved, and there's a number of things that are taken into account. One is the composition of the traffic makeup. Another one is the soils that will be beneath the pavement. If you have a weaker soil beneath the pavement, you'll need a stronger, thicker pavement consisting of more aggregate base or gravel, as well as thicker concrete or asphalt. And from the traffic composition, you can have a road that maybe has, you have a lower volume road that maybe goes to say like a landfill. And if there's very few cars on it, but a high amount of trucks that are loaded with, highly loaded with material that's going to the landfill, as opposed to say if you had say one of our county trunk highways that if there's little to no truck traffic on it, but a great number of cars, it's the trucks that are doing the damage to the roadways. And oftentimes I believe the person that authored the question had it correctly. Oftentimes we're not capturing say the fee from those vehicles that are doing the damage. I know prior to my life in my work life in the county here, I worked in consulting, and on one occasion we actually did an impact fee study in the Wisconsin Rapids area, where we were looking at damage that was being done to the local roadways due to a landfill. So there are, even if it's not by gas tax or registration fees, there can be mechanisms that can be put in place to try to capture user fees, if we'll call it that, by the vehicles that are doing the damage to some of the roadways.
Morgan, I have a question for Professor Tabatabai. how would you assess the technology transfer process in Wisconsin to transfer university research findings to local decision makers?
Well, for many years there was a big issue with results of research not being implemented across the nation, and that has a number of factors associated with it. Of course, change is difficult, and there is also the need by the community to realize, to make sure that these new processes are actually doing what they promise to do. So that now, though, realizing that we need to implement some of these innovations, there are, for example, Wisconsin DOT has an implementation plan in its research program. So we make sure the results of research can be translated to their specifications, their bridge manual, and be able to more effectively implement it. Now, how that, to some extent, state can, when it provides funding, can have broader county level also enforce some of those things. But on the maintenance side, it's not well implemented generally across county and state, because it's a lot more on a new design. It's a lot more controls. On maintenance is more locally implemented. So we do need more training, more transfer of these technology in an effective way, and hopefully we can work on that and make that the reality, because bottom line is that all these improvements have to be applied in the field to have any results.
Thank you. Morgan, next question.
Sure. This question comes from Lisa, who asks, with the advent of electric vehicles, shouldn't we tax by weight of vehicle rather than penalizing lighter vehicles that do less damage than big, heavy ones?
Who would like to address that?
I'm not going to address I don't know anything about budgets and costs associated with that. But on the question of load itself is a factor, but it's not the only factor. In Wisconsin and all northern states where you use de-icing salts, at least on bridges, that's the primary mode of damage and deterioration long term. It far exceeds, at least on bridges. Roadways, it's a little bit different, but on bridges and bridge decks, and the use of de-icing salts is the primary factor. So the load itself is not, and that damage making the road safe for cars and small and big applies across the board. So that's all I wanted to mention.
Would anyone else like to respond?
I guess that I was trying to, like I said, I know that one of the last questions was about weigh stations, but I had been kind of following the chat as, the meeting has gone along here, and I did see that question. So I guess my last response, the example of traffic impact fees, studies like that can be used to allocate fees to the actual users. That's one example I used. I mean, obviously, if as a state we're going to look at implementing, fees like that takes a much broader perspective. But like I say, there are mechanisms like transportation impact fees at the local level that can be implemented to try to capture some of the damage to the roads that's being done by the actual users.
I would just jump in. We do have heavy truck fees for commercial trucks. They do not pay the same registration fee that you and I pay for our personal vehicle. And when we had the last 2019 budget, Governor Evers did propose a 27% increase in heavy truck fees. I believe at the time I calculated that that would have put us probably number 5 in the nation as far as what we charge commercial trucks. So we do it, whether it's the right amount. We can always debate that. I know that there's a congressional study that they're thinking about on the federal side as well, to study, again, the impact of heavy commercial trucks and making sure that we're charging the right amount. But there is a difference between commercial vehicles and what they pay in the average personal vehicle.
Carl, you look like you were about ready to jump in.
I just wanted to comment that, you know, in the United States, there are 50 states, and every state has a different way of funding their infrastructure repairs and improvements. Within those 50 states, there are several counties. There are several municipalities. There are sometimes transportation authorities. They all have the authority and all vary in their methodologies for the way that they charge to maintain the infrastructure that they're associated with. So, I mean, when you know, and it's been brought up before by other members of this panel, I was so glad to hear it, everything is tied together. If, for example, we take the heavier weights off of our roadways, a couple of things are going to happen. Yes, we will do less damage to the roadways. We will also collect less in fees somehow to maintain that one way or another. You know, we've kind of gone over what the state of Wisconsin, as an example, does, because that's what we're dealing with right now. Already around the United States, there are vehicle mileage studies being done. The state of Oregon has, for the last several years now, been doing something where it's voluntary and you can sign up to pay for, you won't pay a gasoline tax, for example. You will pay a vehicle mileage tax. You will actually attach something to your car, a little odometer that tells how much you're doing. And I believe I think the way they've got it set up is every 3 months, you just would submit what you paid in taxes at the pump, and you would get that money back from the state. In the meantime, you would pay so much per mile for your use, and it would only be for your use. So again, everything is tied together. I want, you know, everyone needs to keep that in mind as we're going through this. There is no magic bullet to solve all the problems. I wish there was. I'm sure we all wish there was, but it's going to take a lot of hard work, a lot of efficiencies, which this has been discussed also, efficiencies in the way we do things. And I honestly believe that the Wisconsin Department of Transportation has done a very good job of being very proactive with the way that they do their projects. And, you know, just things that go into the projects as far as example, we do everything under construction or under traffic, excuse me. When the pandemic first hit and traffic was down, we found that we were able to do more projects for less money because we weren't dealing with traffic all the time. Most people do not understand how on a lot of projects, we keep it open to traffic, and that costs a lot of money to do that. I'm sure Brian knows that from his work. So, you know, there's just different ways to do things, but it's what the knowledge base that we have and what will, in this case, roads and bridges are used by the public. What is the public going to accept?
Okay, Morgan, next question.
Sure. This one is on bridges. Louise asks, what is the chemical composition of the polymer used on bridge surfaces? Is it environmentally safe?
In tin polymer overlays, there is a layer. First of all, the surface is clean. There is a very thin layer of glue, essentially epoxy. There's variations on that, but it's mainly epoxy that are put in a very thin layer, and then there is some aggregates that are broadcast over the top that they stick to that glue. That glue will seal the surface against the salts getting in. The aggregate helps you with the friction that reduces accident, especially on the curves and so on. So it is not, first of all, it's a very small amount, and it is not, to my knowledge, it's very, it adheres to concrete, and it's not going to get into the environment in any way.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment? Okay, and the next question.
Sure. This question is to Mark. Dorothy asked, do infrastructure builders get their training on the job or at technical colleges or both? And what kind of training programs are there in rural Wisconsin?
Good question. A lot of construction learning is done on the job. That's the most important spot. But of course, there are registered apprenticeship programs. There are technical college programs that are part of that, as we call it in workforce development, the ecosystem that supports how someone learns, both on the job, in the classroom, and beyond. I think this is a major challenge, actually. The Department of Transportation does have some challenges operating training programs outside of the major urban areas. In part, it's hard to get scale of people. And as some of you know, there's certain places in the state where when you're building a highway or some sort of roadway, if you have some aspiration to bring some more diversion or diversity or inclusiveness into the workforce, it may not be there. Our neighbor to the west, Minnesota, that problem is even worse, because once you get probably 50 miles past the Mississippi River, there's not a whole lot more, but those freeways need to be built or maintained, those roads. So there is some training infrastructure in place here in Wisconsin. It's a little more limited in the more rural areas, I would say, certain areas. It needs to be put on steroids. We need to get people pumped into that system, and in preparation for an infrastructure package that comes through, and to sustain the future. Back to the main question, my main point would be, where are we going to be 15 to 20 years from now, when the next crop of retirees is gone, and those skill sets are lost, when we can't bet on technology or new technologies to simply replace people on some of these things. Some of that will happen, but it's not going to happen overnight.
Thank you. Morgan, the next question.
Yeah, I guess this is kind of a follow-up from Chris to Mark again. How are the trade unions recruiting for skilled employment in building infrastructure?
Well, it just so happens that I know Chris, and I haven't spoken to her in probably, I don't even know how long, maybe it's 20 years, but she knows the answer. I mean, there are some programs, particularly in the greater Milwaukee area. The organization I was involved with was doing recruiting for some of the apprenticeship programs. You work in the schools, you work in the community that's most impacted, trying to identify individuals who have interest. And then, of course, once the interest is found, that's when the hard work begins, the preparation, the reality checks, the challenges that need to be overcome. And again, a lot of that work is done on a shoestring. The presumption is that, if there's projects to be done, people will come, or people will figure it out on their own. The problem is we don't really have that luxury any longer to just expect that it's going to take care of itself. And frankly, the problem is getting bigger in many different sectors. It's not just, the construction industry as a whole, or in particular, the infrastructure or highway systems.
Okay, thank you. Morgan, next question.
Sure. This question was directed to Kyle, who had to go, but Kyle did say that Debbie or someone else may be able to answer questions directed to him. So Dorothy asked to give an example of the efficiencies you recommend to stretch the infrastructure funding.
Debbie, is that something you can take?
Yes, as I brought it up, I do a lot of work with the county highway groups, and they talk about their projects a lot. And again, I'm not an engineer, but I like to highlight the work they do because they're really some of the most knowledgeable people about our local infrastructure. And a simple thing that they're doing that is making projects go through faster. They're bundling bridges. So they find, let's say, 3 bridges or 4 bridges in a county or in adjacent counties that are similar enough that they can literally design them and then get the same contractor and move forward. So there's efficiencies of scale by that simple process. So again, it may not be revolutionary, but it's something that they have been testing. DOT has also been working on the requirements regarding very simple bridges and taking out some of the complexity that maybe isn't necessary when you're talking about a road project or a bridge project that is in a more rural area with very little traffic. So those are the ones that I know about.
Tony, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, actually, I was gonna chime in. Obviously in the presentation on the bridge chapters, we talked about the design, bid, build process for a project as well as design, build. So I guess to reiterate what, obviously the design, bid, build, a designer designs it, and then the DOT sets it out to bid to contractors, contractors bid on it, and then they build it. What the design build tries to do is kind of condense that. So you're almost designing it at the same time as you're building it. You're getting a little ahead, and so that obviously reduces the amount of time that it takes to build a project, and there's a lot more efficiencies when the designer and the builder are working hand in hand. There was recent pilot programs that WISDOT is using to utilize that type. I think there was legislation previously that kind of outlawed it in the state. We're actually one of the only states that had that legislation that said that we couldn't use that process. So that's kind of one of the ways, recently that WISDOT is trying to streamline the whole project process. So.
Okay, thank you. Morgan, next question.
I think that covered a lot of the questions that were asked in the chat. I don't know if anyone has anything else they'd like to ask out loud right now.
I have another question for Tony. Is it more important to provide funding for bridge replacement projects or for bridge rehabilitation and maintenance projects?
That's a great question. Obviously the theme I think today is we need more funding, and unfortunately, I feel like a lot of times on projects we're trying to decide between those two. Looking back to the presentation, obviously the average bridge in Wisconsin is 40 years old and coming up to the end of what its intention or its expectant life was supposed to be. I guess you look at that and you think, well, then you need to start replacing more bridges to lower that age. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. It really depends on it gets to be project specific. You kind of have to look at the different, for a given structure, whether replacing it or rehabbing it extending its life. There's a lot of old bridges out there that may not need replacement, but timely maintenance might extend the life of it, and therefore increase the efficiency of the dollars being spent on it. I think the more important thing to look at is maybe the economic impact of the bridge. I mentioned posting restrictions. Trying to fix those or those type of bridges to reduce economic impact. When you have a road, when you have a posted bridge, a heavy truck can't drive on it, and therefore has to go a different route. Well, that price gets passed on. If it's some sort of consumer good, gets passed on to the consumer. We pay higher prices for things that get trucked and have to go different routes. So increasing, looking at particularly at bridges that have load restrictions. There's also small bridges or bridges out in rural areas that we need to focus. We may need to focus on, because if the bridge goes out there, there's obviously a headache or expanded detours or whatnot that adds to not just the cost of goods, but the cost of lost time and fuel to the average driver. So yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that there's a great answer in terms of we should always replace versus rehab. I really think it's specific to the given bridge, and I think that's the job of the engineer and WISDOT and the project managers to make that determination whether it's needed or not.
Okay, thank you. Morgan, any question? I have one more question from
I
Mark.
would say Lisa has had her
Lisa,
hand up.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, I guess the first question I had was, is anybody using, I understand that concrete has a disproportionate impact on climate change, but there's some new stuff out that can sequester carbon. And I just wondered if that's being used. That's one question. And the other one is, when you talk about salt being the impact on bridges, I know there are chloride levels of our local lakes in southeast Wisconsin has been going up because of salt use. But what I've driven on some of the mountain passes in Colorado that are steep and slippery, and they use cinders or something else. And I just wonder if there's some other alternatives to salt that would save our bridges and save our cars too. So I guess two questions. Is the carbon sequestered concrete something that's practical, that's being used actually beyond the theoretical?
Actually, let me take a stab at that. To answer your last question, yes, the issue is scale. Actually, at UW Milwaukee a few years ago, a PhD dissertation by Dr. Bruce Ramey tackled that issue, and the technologies are there. It's just the matter of, for carbon sequestration in concrete. But it's the issue of scale, how you would get to that. In terms of reducing carbon footprint, yes, there is a lot of work being done, and also done by replacing cement with substitute materials. We call them pozzolans, that are typically waste industrial materials that improve properties. We can easily go up to reduce the cement content, which is the big impact on CO2 emissions, with these the replacement materials. And I forgot your middle question, so. You're muted, I think.
You're muted, Lisa.
Oh, it was about salt substitutes, something that won't destroy the bridges.
Oh, yes, there are. How the issue is economics, the cost of them. There are that are substitutes that would be effective, but the costs are far higher, and that the economics of it hasn't worked out yet. But that's why it's continuing to use.
And I think I got the message that that was our last question, and we need to go on to wrapping up.
I could add
Thank you.
one thing to the salt question that Lisa had. One thing, it's more of a, instead of using salt, trying to minimize or maybe minimize the use or maximize the effectiveness. So just going back as recently as maybe like 10 years or so ago, I mean, the county highway departments, of which I work for one of the 72, we're the ones that are doing at least the bulk of the plowing and winter maintenance on the state highways, the interstate system, and the county highways. Not all the county highways, but a lot of the county highway departments are trying to use salt more effectively. We are one of those counties. Like I said, about 10 years or so ago, counties would just kind of dump the salt out onto the road. And if you have a piece of dry salt that hits the pavement, it's just going to bounce off, end up in the shoulders, end up in our waterways. So one of the first methodologies that was utilized was to pre-wet the salt. So there's actually like salt brine put in tanks on the trucks that pre-wets the salt. So it wets, if you're using still rock salt, it wets the salt. So when it hits the pavement, it's staying in place more, not bouncing off the roads. It takes, it goes into solution and acts faster. We are one county, we're actually trying to use liquid salt more. So use a brine as much as we can rather than using rock salt. So
Brian, we need to wrap up. Thank you very much for adding that. I want to thank all of our panel members, Debbie Jackson, Mark Kucinich, Kyle Christensen, and Habib Tabatabai, for the valuable contributions you made to the discussion and answering questions. Next slide, please. There are 5 more programs. June 17th is the next one on transit and aviation. So please register and join us. We've got an interesting lineup of presenters and panelists for that one as well. The next slides, Louise will continue and close out the meeting. I want to thank everyone for your contributions to these meetings. I want to thank the audience for attending and for your very good questions, and for all of you authors and panelists for contributing to the discussion. Louise?
Thank you, Carol. I too appreciate every word I heard today. Better informed. I have read the report card, and I appreciate the discussion immensely. We thank Carl Sutter for arranging for the category order authors and for his comments today. We thank Martin Hansen for his many contributions to this project, especially in the overview series that we conducted earlier. Also, thanks go to Ken Micah and Jennifer Schaff, who were not on today's program, but who did serve as volunteer co-chairs of the report card that we were drawing from today. And finally, thank you to Carol Diggleman for arranging today's 4 panel members and for moderating today's meeting. Next slide, please. Thank you also to the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin planning team. We are mostly volunteer members from around our state, and our League of Women Voters staff also deserves thanks for their contributions to this educational program about Wisconsin's roads and bridges infrastructure. Thanks also to our technology manager, Daniel Sparacino. Next, please. The League of Women Voters has partnered with the ASCE in this project to educate League members and the public about the Wisconsin's infrastructure, its condition, based on their 2020 Wisconsin Infrastructure Report Card. We now urge a call to action. Sounds like a repeat of what Kyle Christensen said. A call made more compelling by recent proposals for significant federal infrastructure spending. So we encourage you to attend future category meetings and spread the word among your contacts. Identify the kinds of infrastructure that you have in your community and begin a conversation with your neighbors and your local officials, whether elected or hired, about the infrastructure in your locale. Jot down your concerns about those priorities and that you have for infrastructure. Be sure not to keep the word to yourself. Tell your concerns to all your elected officials, federal, state, county, town, and municipal. Find out their positions on infrastructure and get active with your local league or the state league. You can track local actions and legislation, and to track legislation at the state level, sign up for the Wisconsin Legislative Notification Service. Stay in touch with the League of Women Voters. Contact us at lwwisconsin@lwvi.org. Do sign up for future category meetings by going to our website. On the left side of our homepage, scroll down and you will find Study on Wisconsin's Infrastructure at the bottom left. There you can not only sign up for future infrastructure programs, but you can also watch today's and the one on energy. Thank you once again. Next slide. Thank you very much for joining us for this Roads and Bridges meeting this afternoon. Have a good evening.